Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I'm delighted to welcome you here to the book launch of this amazing book called Reclaiming Populism, which was written by Paul Summerville and Eric Protzer. Paul is a long-term friend of mine, and we used to work together in banking when Paul was in finance, where he spent many of his years. He's now a professor at the Gustafsson School of Business at Victoria. And Eric, who was formerly at MIT, is now at the Harvard Growth Lab, where both of them wrote this book. I was delighted to be invited to chair this meeting because I really like the book. It solved some issues for me which were really pressing, the question of inequality and how to deal with inequality. And the book is a scientific book, basing it not just on some philosophical argument, but on real science, real data, which I found very impressive. This is not the first time this book is being discussed. Eric and Paul have been invited on the far left spectrum to the Thomas Piketty world of inequality. And you all know Piketty has different views of inequality, but it was very well received. And then on the right, at the UK conservative think tank, Onward UK. I was part of that discussion, and it was surprising to see how they embraced the ideas which Paul and Eric put forward. It was also discussed at the Institute for New Economy at Oxford, and will be discussed at LSE and other institutions. By the way, if you in the audience want to invite Paul and Eric to discuss it at your institution, please send them a note. They would be delighted to do so. This discussion will be in the format which will be managed by Rick Wolff, who you can see, I can see him here on the left of my screen. Rick has had a successful career in advertising before he established a company called Poststone, where he has been helping clients, in the word of one of his clients, to find truth about themselves by helping them talk honestly, like families do at the kitchen table. And the kitchen table is actually the format this discussion is going to take. With this, I would like to hand over to Rick, please. You are on mute.
Of course. Thank you, Marcus, and my thanks to everyone for joining us today for the launch of Reclaiming Populism. You will be hearing from the authors, Eric Protzer and Paul Summerville. Also, to comment on the book and join Eric and Paul in the conversation that Marcus described, we've invited two distinguished guests, Professor Ian Goldin and Ambassador Bob Rae. As their accomplishments are great and many, I will introduce them by their current positions and a reminder of their contribution to our world. Ian Goldin is Professor of Globalization and Development at the University of Oxford. He is author of over 20 books. The most recent is Rescue: From Global Crisis to a Better World. Professor Goldin is a thought leader in how to best navigate the difficult years ahead for the human race and all the species of nature that we share the earth with. Bob Rae is Canada's current ambassador to the United Nations, author of 10 books, the most recent, What's Happened to Politics. Ambassador Rae is a shining example of the kind of true leader described by Theodore Roosevelt as a person who has lived life in the arena and has known the greatest highs and lows of public life. Ambassador Rae, Professor Goldin, we're so delighted that you can be with us today. We are all better off for the commitment of these two men to making our world safe and fair for everyone, and we are very grateful. And lastly, speaking to all of you who have come to join us today, should you have a question, please use the Q&A tab on the bottom of your screen. I think you'll find it over to the right of row of tabs on your screen. Please input your question there. Time is tight today, so for those questions we are not able to take during the session, Eric and Paul will respond to you directly. Now, Paul Summerville and Eric Protzer to tell you about the book.
Thank you to everyone for joining us here today. I'm Paul Summerville. Eric and I want to thank Marcus and Rick for helping us stage this book launch, and to Jonathan Smith, currently in Eastbourne, who will curate the questions from our audience. We must also amplify Rick's introduction of Ambassador Rae and Professor Goldin. having the chance to expose the thesis of our book in this 21st century Lyceum to the intellect and debate-ready skill of these two authors and practitioners is exhilarating. The next hour will surely be one of the most important of our book's journey. For our discussion today, we will focus on three key themes in the book. First, populism strikes hardest when the economy is unfair. Second, countries with high social mobility are resistant to populism. And third, a fair, socially mobile economy is possible through equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes, working as hard to achieve economic fairness as we do economic growth. Eric and I started working on reclaiming populism 3 years ago. We were both intrigued and worried by the populist eruptions that had occurred in a host of important high-income countries, as well as the sharp authoritarian tilt in a number of new democracies. We soon discovered that the existing political debate did not adequately speak to economic fairness the way that most citizens understand it. Consequently, the mainstream was unable to respond positively and in fact made things worse, while the enemies of liberal democracy pounced. Our book shows that a combination of policy failures have in key countries both weakened the extent to which opportunity is equal and reward is according to contribution. And this has made it harder for many citizens, their children and their children's children to get ahead on their own merits. Two important consequences are low social mobility and high vulnerability to economic shocks. Thus, the life chances of an important share of the population are to a large extent predetermined by the income of their parents, leading many citizens to conclude that the system is rigged. This understanding is at the heart of the populist challenge because it invalidates the most popular explanations for the success of modern day populists, in particular, income inequality and immigration. As noted economist Philip McCann wrote last month, citing our book's technical appendix available online as a working paper, quote, social mobility is the crucial indicator of populist voting, unquote. And he adds bitingly, all other explanations are mantras. Our book asks, what can policymakers and politicians do about this? We argue that to rebuild fair, socially mobile economies, they must embrace the twin virtues of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. Our book demonstrates that, on the whole, people are deeply opposed to equalized outcomes, but prize fair, unequal outcomes. Let me repeat this. People are deeply opposed to equalized outcomes, but prize fair, unequal outcomes. It is vital to differentiate equal opportunity from equal outcomes, which are far too often incorrectly conflated. Opportunity is greatly a function of what a society provides so that citizens can live their lives as much as possible on their own terms. Outcomes are the consequences of the pursuit of those life chances. Millions and millions and millions of people pursuing their own paths will, by any understanding of the human condition, inevitably result in very, very unequal outcomes. This is a good thing, provided, of course, these outcomes are achieved fairly. Eric will now present our findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and also to everybody else. I have some slides that I'll share here today just as a visual aid, and also to share with everybody in the audience a 30% discount code. If you'd like to buy the book, I'll show this at the beginning and the end of my slides. You can go to politybooks.com, that's our publisher, search for the book Reclaiming Populism, and at checkout, enter the 30% discount code NNE21. Excellent. So today I'm going to talk about two sort of main themes of the book that encapsulates the ideas that we've been talking about thus far. First being that populism strikes hardest when the economy is unfair. And second, that a fair and socially mobile economy is possible through equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. Importantly, the thesis of our book is fundamentally that populist disruptions such as Trump and Brexit and the Gilets jaunes strike hardest when the economy is unfair. By that, we mean that citizens are angry, not due to income inequality or wealth inequality per se, but economic unfairness. The sense of being unfairly held back from success because opportunity is not equal and reward is not according to contribution. Whether a citizen has had an unlucky start in life or has been knocked down by an economic shock, economic unfairness makes it difficult for those in precarious economic positions to get ahead on their own merits. That in turn leads to the perception of a rigged system in need of forceful correction, and hence the impetus towards populism. Vitally, fair economic outcomes, as emphasized, are not the same as equalized economic outcomes. Fairness entails equal opportunity, but then different and unequal outcomes fairly allocated depending on a citizen's contribution. To drive this point home, this is a quote from Angus Deaton, Nobel laureate in economics, where he wrote in a column that inequality is not the same thing as unfairness. And to my mind, it is the latter that has incited so much political turmoil in the rich world today. Some of the processes that generate inequality are widely seen as fair, but others are deeply and obviously unfair and have become a legitimate source of anger and disaffection. In fact, once you effectively separate out these two concepts of fairness and equality, the behavioral science literature is fairly clear, as seen in this paper, for instance, by the Yale psychologists Starman, Sheskin, and Bloom, that there is no evidence that people are bothered by economic inequality itself. Rather, they are bothered by something that is often confounded with inequality, economic unfairness. We spend a whole chapter in the book going into that idea in detail, and we hope that you'll find that compelling. In addition to looking at the psychological basis of economic fairness and unfairness, however, we concretely show that the violation of economic fairness in practice leads to populism. And one of the major ways we do that is by investigating social mobility. In this situation, we are referring to low social mobility, where it means that individual economic success strongly depends on family wealth. And a situation like that, of course, is a clear violation of economic fairness, because reward in that situation is according to your family origins and not according to your actual contribution. In our book, Reclaiming Populism, we demonstrate that low social mobility is a robust statistical predictor of the geography of contemporary rich world populism, both across and within high-income countries. And vitally, factors like income and wealth inequality, immigration, and the rate of social media use do not have the same statistical power. The research behind the book linking low social mobility to populism has been cited in official documents by the UN, the IMF, the Inter-American Development Bank, and also being featured by Brookings. And vitally, as Paul mentioned, Professor Philip McCann of the University of Sheffield, the man who coined the term geography of discontent, cited the research behind our book to write that social mobility is the crucial indicator of populist voting. In addition to that relationship between social mobility and unfairness and populism, in the book, we argue that citizens living in unfair economies are especially vulnerable to shocks like globalization and the global financial crisis, and face unfair recoveries from those sorts of issues. And you can think intuitively, we expound this at length in the book, that if it's hard to get ahead in life from an unlucky start, then it's likely also hard to get ahead after you've been knocked down by a shock. Of course, if you find that argument compelling about a relationship between economic unfairness and populism, the next natural question to ask is, how do you actually go about building a fairer economy with higher social mobility? And we argue in the book that a fair, socially mobile economy is possible through the twin virtues of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. Something we want to emphasize right off the bat is that a lot of the traditional political discussion that you hear about creating a successful socially mobile economy is deeply flawed. The conventional perspective on whether it's simply a matter of big or small government, we show is wrong. In this chart here, we have government spending as a share of GDP in 2019 on the x-axis, and on the vertical axis, We have countries arranged from those with low social mobility at the top of the graph and high social mobility at the bottom. And you can see that there are countries spanning the gamut of the range of size of government that all suffer from low social mobility. You can think of small government places like Switzerland, the United States, arguably the United Kingdom, but also places with quite large governments like Italy and especially France that all suffer from low social mobility. And that sort of relationship should lead us to ask, well, what, if that's the case, really are the policy inputs that truly underpin social mobility? What are the specific things that countries get right if it's not just this simple matter of big or small government? We argue, as said, that the key inputs can be organized under the categories of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. You can think of places like Australia, Canada, and the Scandinavian countries that pair state-sponsored equal opportunity with competitive markets. These countries, the data shows, are socially mobile and they're also populism resistant. You can think of how Australia and Canada have not had to deal with anything like the Trump phenomenon, and how the Nordic countries, in spite of experiencing the enormous shock of the 2015 European migrant crisis, in fact, have not had to deal with anything quite like Brexit, have not experienced the mass protests of the Gilets jaunes, and in the 2019 European Parliament election, for example, voted for populists at rates below 20%, which was not only below the European Union average, but well below the rates seen in places like Italy and France and the United Kingdom, which voted for populists at the rates in the whopping range of 30 to 50%. On the flip side, countries or regions that fail on either of these types of inputs tend to suffer the consequences. The United States, for example, has competitive outcomes, to be sure, but it has a frayed social safety net and it does not support equal opportunity. France, on the other hand, has world-class public services, but it regulates and taxes away the fruits of success, making it hard to get ahead. Both of these countries, in turn, suffer from low social mobility and house fierce populist movements. Another way you can imagine this way that equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes contribute to a socially mobile economy, which perhaps is a little more intimate and personal, is by imagining the life trajectory of someone who experiences social mobility. You could imagine that, say, we're thinking of someone who is born into a working class family and they aspire to become middle class. When this person is starting off in life, you can think that there are a wide variety of inputs related to equal opportunity that they may need in order to become productive, to access the job market, and be able to make that kind of progress without being derailed by some sort of unfair exogenous shock. You can think of not only the conventional input of education, which tends to dominate the social mobility discussion, but also importantly, things like healthcare to ensure that your family isn't bankrupted by an illness, derailing your future. Things like infrastructure for personal transport to ensure that you're able to get where the best opportunities and the best education are, and even things like housing along a similar line. In the book, we go into a wide range of inputs, but the point is simply that these things are multitudinous. It's not just simply a matter of education. There are very many inputs supporting equal opportunity. In turn, once someone has reached a point in their life where they have become productive, they're present in the right geography they need to be in to compete, the next element that they need in order to get ahead and move into the middle class is the principle of fair, unequal outcomes. And those are important essentially for two reasons. One, to ensure that the value that they create is in fact rewarded so that they can really capture that value and get ahead and not just be stuck in, sort of a theoretical point of being theoretically productive, but not actually being able to translate that to success. And second, the importance of fairness in those unequal outcomes so that their path to success is not undermined by cheaters. You can think of things like flexible labor markets so that it's easy to find a job, to get hired, to hire other people if you're starting a business, even infrastructure investment to support business, and also things like regulation and justice enforcement so that if you're starting a business or trying to compete in the market, you're not doing so against unfair practitioners like monopolists or those who might undercut safety standards. In turn, you can think about because there are so many multitudinous inputs to social mobility under these twin virtues of equal opportunity and fair unequal outcomes, that a natural consequence is that very few countries in practice actually have high social mobility. This is a critical argument of the book that differentiates us from a lot of the argumentation out there. It's vital that it's not just one single policy input that supports social mobility. There are many things going on. And importantly, for you policymakers in the audience, we spend an entire chapter showing how you can home in on what are the biggest policy constraints to social mobility in a particular country or a particular region, drawing on the diagnostic method where I work at Harvard's Growth Lab. I'll show again this blurb here on how you can get a discount code for the book. It's NNE21 on politybooks.com. Thanks so much. Rick, you're muted.
Thank you, Eric and Paul. Let's turn now to some brief remarks by our two illustrious guests, and then from there into open conversation. Professor Ian Goldin, can we start with you, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rick, and to you and Marcus for giving me an opportunity to comment on this really excellent book and timely book by Paul and Eric. I think it really is a major contribution to our understanding of this vital topic, and I encourage participants to read it if you haven't already done so. There are many things that come to mind in reading the book, and let me just highlight a number of those, and hopefully we can come back to some in conversation. The first is trying to understand why populism seems to come in waves. The issues of fairness, which are alluded to, are not new. They've been there for a very long time, and yet we see populism ebbing and flowing. What is it? Is it changes in perceptions of social fairness? If it's not inequality, that leads to this transformation of societies into populist movements. And I would argue, and this is very much the thesis of my book, Age of Discovery, which compares our time to the Renaissance, that part of this is new narratives that get told, and part of the ability to tell new narratives and to create different coalitions of the way people think is through new technologies. In our time, social media, internet, web-based. In the time of the Renaissance, it was the printing press, and that allowed a massive redefinition of what fairness is, what society was doing, and a breaking of the orthodoxy, particularly of the control of the traditional media, be it the Catholic Church then, or be it the traditional media now, which basically were part of this old orthodoxy, the center of different types. But it can move very quickly. And we saw this with the rise of populism in Europe after the Depression, leading into the Second World War, the rise of fascism in Italy, but also in other countries. So something triggers and something changes. And that I'd like to hear more from Eric and Paul as this transformation in populism and what leads to these sometimes tidal waves of populism that come forth when people suddenly express it. And I would suggest that something in the narrative is about that. Crises clearly, as you've pointed to and talk about in the book, are vitally important. Crises in the Great Depression, other crises. And I don't believe that we would have had President Trump in the White House or Brexit in Britain if it hadn't been for the financial crisis. It totally discredited the old authorities and their narratives. But it also did lead to very sharp increases in inequality. And although you rightly, I think, emphasize the social fairness and say it's not inequality, I think these two things are inextricably linked. I think a lot of what people perceive to be fairness issues are related to changes in inequality or perceptions of inequality, and that changes rapidly over time. Not only in how people perceive to fairness and whether who's paying tax and where that tax is going, but even in what wealth is legitimate or not, what is fair in wealth. We don't begrudge football players earning, or movie stars or musical stars earning exorbitant salaries, but we do begrudge bank CEOs doing that. Why? What is it in perceptions around fairness that allow some things to be legitimate and other things illegitimate? And that changes too rapidly over time. And of course, transparency also changes that. If a couple of the big billionaires in the US say that they believe in fairness, and then we discover through the Panama or other P papers that they're only paying 3% tax, our perception of that legitimacy changes. But it is related, I think, to both inequality and fairness. It's also the case that growing inequality is acceptable in growing societies, but I don't think it's as acceptable in stagnating societies. And this question of where you are, and one of the reasons I think we've seen rapid growths in inequality associated with populism in the advanced economies is because they're basically stagnating. We are taking shares of a fixed pie. Productivity growth is close to zero in North America and in Europe, and that's very different to China, where rapidly rising inequalities are still associated with growth of everyone, for everyone. And even the poorest are doing much better than they were in the past, and see the prospect of that continuing. But I think it's this intersection. You emphasize opportunities. I think that's right. And I particularly would emphasize the opportunity of outcome. As Tony Atkinson, who was a wonderful professor at Oxford, who passed away a couple of the years, emphasized on his work on inequality. The race of life is unfair. And you might all have the same 100 meters to run, and you might all start at the same time, but some of you have your legs tied together, and some are blindfolded, and some have their hands tied behind themselves. And so how you overcome that apparent equality of opportunity, or how one perceives it, and that's changing dramatically, not least with respect to our understanding of, for example, gender discrimination, or discrimination of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic, or disability discriminations, and so on. Our perception of what's fair is very different today from what it would have been 20 or 30 years ago, based on this understanding of the disabilities or abilities. I think youth are particularly important in the populist story. It's no accident when one looks at the pictures of who was occupying the capital, it tended to be young people, but the same is true when you look at, for example, voting patterns for the populist parties that came out of the Euro crisis in Europe. It's a lot of frustrated young people, and that's of course toxic, but it begs the question as to why one doesn't have more populism in some places. Why don't we have more populism in North Africa, for example, where ages are very young and unemployment is very high? And it's something else about the legitimacy of this is important. The final point I would make is about the importance of place. It strikes me that not only are you able to discern that populism is particularly associated with certain countries where there's low social mobility, as you have, but within countries, populism is very geographically uneven. In the UK, there's very little populism in London. There's populism from outside London. And when you look at the voting patterns on Brexit, and I think the similar thing is true in the US, it's not really a big urban phenomena. It's mostly not, and the question is why? Why is populism so defined by place? Even in France, the Gilets jaunes were bussed into Paris. And I would argue it's because the nature of opportunity is dramatically transforming. And it's happening in new places and different places. And it's no point telling someone in the Midwest that there's full employment in Silicon Valley and they should go there. And in the end, as part of your prescriptions, therefore, on how you create more social fairness, I would place a little bit more emphasis on what makes people more geographically mobile. And that's about housing markets, transport systems, ability to get to where the jobs are. It's about school places. It's about places to care for your elderly parents. It's about the other things that hold you back in places that are being left behind by history. Of course, there's a whole debate about whether people want to move or not. But most people do move. And in the US, you see this dramatic decline. There's about a quarter the mobility between US counties today than there was 40, 50 years ago. And the same is true in Britain, much less geographical mobility, and in Europe. And the question is, what has that got to do with populism and people's ability to feel that they can be part of the future rather than trapped in the past and the anger they express, therefore, through political moments? Thank you.
Just a couple of words, Rick.
Yes.
It's really good to see everybody else on the screen, and I'm honored to be in this company. I have, in my own somewhat idiosyncratic way, been thinking about these issues for the better part of my life, I guess. And a couple of things occur to me now. One of them is I think we have to look harder at the immigration issue as something that has a profound contributory effect to populism. If you look at it historically, in a number of countries, including Europe and certainly the United States, with waves of immigration have always been met by, in some cases, increasing resistance to the other and to other people and to a growth in populism. The Know Nothing movement, for example, in the mid 1850s, can be directly attributed to the arrival of Irish immigrants to the US in a huge and unprecedented wave of unexpected migration. So that's one thing I think is part of the debate. I can remember being part of a very vigorous seminar in England where I was invited to give a paper, and there was sort of a bun fight between those people who said it's all about migration and these things can all be explained by our willingness to deal with immigration, and everybody else saying no, it has everything to do with the economy, it has to do with unemployment and unfairness and lack of mobility and all those other issues. And I said, well, I have the advantage of not being an academic, so I can tell you that from my knocking on door experience as a politician, it's both. And if you think you're doing well, you're much more willing to accept the presence of new people and other people. And if you don't think you're doing well, and you're threatened by the arrival of new people, you're not. So it's you've got to deal with both sides of the argument. But certainly in terms of inflaming the recent growth of populism in Europe and in the United States, I think the issue, it's not so much the issue of migration, it's the perception that people are suddenly going to be swamped by something coming from somewhere else, which has led to the global compacts on migration and on refugees. And we know as well that populism is not exclusively a phenomenon of wealthy countries. When I did my work on the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and it's now even more tense, the situation of the relationship between the host community and those who are coming in from outside has everything to do with what's happening in the economy. The crisis in Bangladesh, in terms of the government's determination to be much more determined about what services it does and doesn't provide, is entirely the product of COVID. COVID has had this extraordinary effect on bringing a lot of workers who were previously overseas home, and that suddenly puts the government in a completely different position than it was in before in terms of its posture. I think the great thing about the book that I really enjoyed and commend to everyone and really appreciate a chance to read it and early and a chance to join in this conversation is that it tries to do something which at the United Nations is almost unheard of, and that is to ask people to look at the facts and to try to deal with the evidence. It's very difficult to have an evidence-based discussion, and that, in fact, is a sign of the growth of populism and various other anti-fact ideologies that surround me here in New York, in a way that I think people living in the academy almost can't believe. But I mean, it's not unusual here to hear people say things that just aren't true. You just say, that's just like, okay. And somebody says, well, I'm entitled to my opinion. You say, well, yeah, but you're also entitled to hear the lack of conformity of your opinion with any evidence that would support your argument. But I think what's good about the discussion as well is that it does make some of these important distinctions and get people to get a little bit more into the weeds of understanding how do we achieve greater social mobility. Ron Daniels, who's the president of Johns Hopkins, has just written a very interesting book it's called Universities and Democracy. And Ron's thesis is, when you look at the legacy admissions to major elite universities in the United States, it's a disgraceful reflection of a lack of mobility. I mean, if essentially you say, well, I'm only here because my father or my grandfather or my great-grandfather was here, and the prevalence of that practice is really quite extraordinary, and I think not widely known or understood. But the number of policies that are in place that actually prevent mobility or are actually intended to directly assist those people who already have stuff is incredible. And I think it's something where one has to go through the piece and look at it much harder. The other issue, I think, which comes home to me certainly in Canada and in the United States, looking at the situation facing younger people today, is the housing market. And I think the unwillingness of governments to understand that one of the most traditional forms of people's sense of mobility was an ability to buy a house and an ability to have that house for a period of time and then get a bigger house. I mean, those are sort of traditional reflections of mobility, which frankly we have to realize that a lot of housing is out of reach and is creating an enormous challenge for younger people as they try to see themselves in a position of getting ahead. So I think, again, we have to look at, well, what are the policies in a very granular way that are actually going to make that more possible? How can we change that equation? Or do we have to rethink the whole housing issue in a different and new way? But it certainly is having a dramatic impact on people's sense of unfairness, people's anger at those who seem to be doing better for no particular reason. And I think what I like, and this is my final point, what I really like about the book is it makes an important distinction in the way in which we sometimes denigrate populism as simply being a bad thing. And you say, well, no, actually, I like the idea that what you're saying is we actually have to recapture the word, because some of what has driven populism has been an entirely understandable and fully justifiable sense of grievance, and that there are real inequalities that cannot be justified in other than that they serve the self-interest of those who already have. And I think this is really where the politics of this gets very interesting, is to see who can effectively marry populist policies with evidence in terms of what will work and what is based on what's actually going on. So there's a lot in this book that I think is forcing us to think, and I think that's always a dangerous thing. But at this stage in my life, I'm delighted to be able to continue to participate in these discussions. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.
And such great thanks to both you, Ambassador Rae and Professor Goldin. You have forced us to think even more, and let's keep up forcing each other to think for the time we have available. Eric Protzer, let's start with the last theme we heard about populism itself and reclaiming the word. Tell us more about that. Tell us more about the unfairness with which we've associated populism. And from there, folks, very quickly, I'd be grateful if Ian and Bob and Paul would all just weigh in. Don't wait for me to open the door for you, please.
Absolutely. So I mean, you know, when we started writing this book, actually, it's kind of funny. Paul and I, our original working title was Defeating Populism. And that's a very, very different framing. And the more we worked on it, and especially working with one of our editors at our publisher, we came to realize that what we were really arguing was not something about just, you know, pushing down populists out of existence because you could just dismiss them. It was quite the opposite. It was that much of the electorate that goes for issues, you know, like Brexit or might swing towards Donald Trump, a lot of these voters have very real frustrations with an unfair economy. And it's thus, you know, not only desirable from an economic justice perspective to try and rectify those issues, it's essential if you're interested in preserving liberal democracy, because you can't just dismiss these people and hope that their concerns go away. They're structural. The economy is structurally unfair, afflicted by low social mobility and high vulnerability to economic shocks in the places that you know, swing towards populism. So it's essential to try and reclaim that populist vote for the political mainstream.
And just, you know, on the point of immigration, I mean, one of the obvious conclusions that people have made is that because populist leaders, liberal leaders, try to wrap themselves up in kind of anti-immigration statements, the fact is that New Zealand, Australia, and Canada have, you know, the highest percentage of foreign-born populations among the rich countries, and yet they've avoided the populist eruptions that's affected the UK and the United States and other places. And so as we thought through how these other explanations actually worked, once it was clear that it was economic unfairness, which was the key indicator, the key driver of populism, issues like immigration, income inequality, social media, these were amplifiers of the problem, but they weren't at the core of the problem. And so this gave us a very different way to look at the host of explanations. And Eric published a paper in the summer of 2019 that systematically, as you know, used the data to, you know, clearly indicate that immigration can't possibly be the explanation because geographically it doesn't hold.
It will be interesting to find out there what is the trigger for it, as Bob said.
Well, I mean, I think if you look, I mean, and Ian's point about the geography is very, as a Canadian, very, very meaningful to me, because Paul's broad statement that Canada is not gone populist. And you know, you got to be careful in thinking that somehow we're immune to this, because I do think that in parts of our own country of Canada, where I mean, in Western Canada, from the prairies, in Saskatchewan, Alberta, in particular, which have been very heavily resource dependent, and where the basis for resource wealth has been seriously challenged over the last several years for a whole variety of reasons. There is a significant increase in populist thinking, and you can see it in terms of not only political behavior, but you know, anti-vax preponderance and so on. These are there, and so I think I mean, I don't think there's only one trigger factor. I think there's a range, but I do think that if you create, I mean, one of the things that our country has done, and the Australians to a slightly lesser extent, I think, have done, but we have certainly created a culture of immigration, a culture where it is readily accepted that the identity of being a Canadian is one that will change and evolve depending on who comes here. And nobody can look at their neighbor and say, well, you know, you have no business being here. You're not from here. So they said, yeah, we're all from all over, and that's who we are. And that's taken a lot of political work over the last several decades to reinforce that political culture. I still don't think it's done. I think the other factor which is so important in looking at the debate in the US, of course, is race, and the way in which race continues to play a role in fueling populism, right-wing populism, as we've defined it. I think that's an unfortunate historical reality that is still very much there.
Some thoughts about this. One of the things I really liked about the book was that I thought you debunked the populism immigration connection, and which I've been trying to do with the data. I think you mobilized more data, but it is clearly part of the narrative. What's also interesting as a sort of second order thing is that immigrants don't tend to be populist, and for reasons which I think are also to do with their sense of continuing social mobility. But it's not only, I think, that immigrants don't tend to be populist in their adopted country. They often are before they leave at home.
Not immigrants.
And but it's also that people who suffer from some of the grossest unfairness, I'm thinking, for example, of Black, Asian, and minority ethnic groups, don't tend to be as populist. But it's also that the gender thing, let's assume that women in general have more unfairness against them, or have an unfairer system stacked against them than men do. It's mostly young males who are white males who are populist. So there's some tensions in perception, and I think it is about the narrative that people believe, or the expectations that people believe that they somehow have rights to advance, and that those have been frustrated by the system, whatever the system is. It's become particularly acute with, I think, the pandemic, where we see, why is it that these particular groups are particularly wedded to anti-vaccination or other fake news, and the crossovers in these communities? But just two totally unrelated points, building on what Bob said. Oxford does not take any legacy or money as a criteria for admission. And I've tried this. I mean, someone wanted to donate a very large amount of money if their son could get in, and the answer was no. So that may mean that we have a slightly more competitive entry scheme. On the other hand, the whole way that you write entrance exams and the whole thing, we see in the bias in the numbers, like you do in the Ivy League in the US, this huge, overwhelming preponderance of certain schools getting their kids into Oxford. It's from where you live and where kids go to school, or the private schools you can afford, that the system is grossly unfair. These things are much wider than just legacies. I think it is right to ask about access, and particularly access to all sorts of institutions. And I certainly empathize with, I was a special representative at the United Nations for a while, and also on the chief executive board of the UN. And it's part of the problem it's political organization, I guess, is the answer, and it's driven by politics.
There's a thread I'd like to pick up. It's the thread that you introduced, Ian, of changing the narrative. Bob, I suppose the one place the narrative can change is on the doorstep, when you're knocking on doors. The facts of a book like Reclaiming Populism can change the narrative. What else? How do policymakers, how do politicians, how do we begin to change the narrative?
Well, I think the narrative follows facts. I mean, it follows the execution of different policies that are quite deliberately set out with the objective of increasing mobility and of reducing inequality, not eliminating it, because I think we all recognize that has its own sets of problems associated with it. But we're facing the UN today. Somebody was talking to me the other day about, there's no trust. I said, well, why would there? Why would there be trust? We haven't executed a global vaccine policy. We haven't executed an effective response to climate change. These things have not happened. So until they happen, you can't expect people to turn around and say, "Now I trust you." You say, trust doesn't come out of the air. Trust is based on behavior that reflects a change. And I think that's what ultimately this book is a political project. It's about saying, how do we actually execute the changes that will then have an impact on what people believe and what they think. And I think specifically, I felt this for some time, specifically talking about what happens when a country loses mobility and the impact that has. It's a terrible thing. And so I think you've got to do whatever you can to create a political program that reflects the need to keep people able to move up, to move forward, and to move ahead. And I think that has enormous appeal for people, and making it practical in terms of how it's done. I think that helps to change the narrative.
One of the things that we hope to accomplish, from the book was to just change the conversation about populism away from this kaleidoscope of explanations that people could kind of pull out, whatever kind of suited them. And that's why in the first chapter, we spend a lot of time trying to debunk, the other explanations. The one, of course, that seems to pervade center and center-right parties is the problem of income inequality. And if we can just manage the issue of income inequality, then it will go a long way to dealing with the problem of populism and all the other things that ail us. In fact, that's not the case. Income inequality isn't our problem. Income inequality is part of how societies organize themselves, how successful societies organize themselves. But the point is, how do you get there? And it was interesting in both the presentation at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and Thomas Piketty, who introduced Eric at his growth lab in Paris, to see how people from both sides of that ideological spectrum had a really hard time kind of getting their hands around that. And of course, one of the things that we say quite clearly is that populism is not ideological. It's not right or left. There tends to be a predominant of right-wing parties, but there's also left-wing examples. So in the case of Thomas Piketty, as I was in London watching the presentation, Eric kept getting a bunch of questions around people trying to work through, well, how can you say that income inequality doesn't matter? I don't understand, even though he consistently and repeated the architecture that we had as an answer. And then at INET, the question was, well, what about Jeff Bezos? I mean, it's terrible that we have to do something about that. And we said, well, maybe we have to. If Amazon was a beneficiary of monopoly capitalism, then maybe. Or if Jeff Bezos isn't taxed fairly. And of course, this is the great Warren Buffett comment, 5 or 6 years ago, that he was being taxed an effective rate of 15% and his secretary at 40%. So trying to get the conversation from places to break through the stale thinking around the conversation and the solutions.
Yeah, I think, Rick, go ahead.
Our time is tight, and I do want to include a couple of questions from our audience today. I must say that you are asking deep and rich questions, and so you will get a more full response when Eric and Paul follow up. But Paul, this is one right in your wheelhouse. How has Japan been able to escape populism?
Well, it's on the verge of not escaping populism. One, I think, is just the nature of the political system in Japan. This one party, which is for many years, exception of a couple of years, able to manage all of the contradictions around how Japan organizes itself. There is a relatively high degree of social mobility in Japan. The Japan shrinking population has actually resulted in per capita income going up. which is not necessarily consistent with countries that have a problem with populism. So it's a combination of how the political system absorbs and deals with political pressures, as well as the way that the economy is organized.
Thank you. And Eric, for you, a request for a definition of populism.
Absolutely. So that's great, because people talk about populism sort of, very loose terms. In the book, we specify that populism is essentially characterized by two things. One, anti-elitism. You can think of how people feel that they're being treated unfairly, and it's all because there are these corrupt elites that are purportedly rigging the system. And secondly, anti-pluralism, or the sense that there's a one true people and only they have a legitimate political say, and the other people who aren't part of that one true people, it's just lock them up.
Thank you. We really are going to try to finish this on time, and there are some closing words all around. Ian Goldin, your final thoughts for today?
Yeah, I think it's a great book, and these issues are central. In terms of changing the narrative, I'm inspired by the experience of the Second World War and how it changed the narrative on the role of government. And as I show in Rescue, my new book, completely redefined the international system and the national system, which then trickled around the world. And I think we're at that moment again in history. I think the pandemic has redefined the role of the state. It's shown that we can change our behavior, and it's an opportunity for this redefinition. The question is, do we bounce back onto the tracks that will lead us over the precipice, or do we do something different going forward? And so I think it's an absolutely crucial time to think deeply about this.
Thank you very much, Bob Rae.
I would say amen to that. And when we look at climate change, we look at COVID, we look at the digital divide, we look at increasing inequality between nations and between regions, those who are left completely behind. And when we look at conflict, what Ian says about creating a new narrative for the nation state is, in my view, the need to create a narrative for the global system. That we need to have an understanding that we require effective global solutions to what are, by their very nature, global problems. Pandemic's not a national problem. Climate change is not a national problem. And we have to create a politics that is based in communities, but that has a global capacity to respond to it. So I've been thinking doing a lot of thinking and reflecting on this, and I'm going to have to go back and read all of Ian's books. So this is going to be a very productive year for me.
A narrative changing experience reading these
exactly
books. And how fitting that a book that started with the title Defeating Populism changed its narrative to reclaiming populism, and changing narrative has been such a powerful part of this conversation today. Thank you all so much, particularly Professor Ian Goldin, Ambassador Bob Rae. We are all very, very grateful. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Marcus Fetter.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, everybody, for this really very interesting discussion about this important issue. I think that before I started reading the book, the idea that populism strikes hardest when a country is, when an economy in a country is unfair, that's somehow common knowledge, and that is something which is intuitively understandable. But that countries with high social mobility are more resistant to populism was something which I didn't get when I read, for instance, Anne Applebaum's really interesting book, Twilight of Democracy. And so this book, Reclaiming Populism, really shed light on this. The idea that a fair, socially mobile economy is possible through equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. That is really the key message in this book. Now, Ian Goldin and Bob, from different perspectives have raised interesting issues and interesting questions. So I think this is definitely the beginning of the next book, which Eric and Paul can write, because Ian and Goldin's questions need to be answered, and they cannot be answered by a panel discussion. So good luck with this. And with this, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to all the attendees, and good evening, and good morning, and good day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Christmas soon. It's a great book. Bye.
Danke schön.